Sunday night, 1965. The Ed Sullivan stage burns white. Freddie Garrity, 5 feet of chaos in a suit too big, launches himself skyward and forgets to land. America laughs. The world exhales. The happiest minute of television, Ed would call it later. Not the best, just the happiest. Freddie would have liked that. Happy was always the goal. We weren't trying to be clever. We were trying to make people happy. He was born Freddie Garrity on November 14, 1936 in Manchester, England, into a world that had very specific ideas about what working-class boys from industrial cities were supposed to become. The answer was workers, like their fathers, like their grandfathers, like everyone they knew. You worked with your hands, earned a modest wage, kept your head down, and died having made no particular mark on anything. His first lesson wasn't about music, it was about making do. His father was a mechanic, practical man who understood machines better than emotions. The family wasn't poor exactly, but they were never far from it either. You patched clothes instead of buying new ones, you made entertainment rather than purchasing it. You learned to find joy in small things because large joys cost money nobody had. Freddie learned early that laughter was free, that making people smile required no capital investment, that being funny was a skill worth developing even if, especially if, you had nothing else to offer. He became the class clown, the kid who could diffuse tension with a joke, who could make the worst day slightly better just by being ridiculous. Could this early understanding that joy was valuable, maybe the most valuable thing, have shaped everything? He was born Freddie Garrity on November 14, 1936 in Manchester, England, into a world that had very specific ideas about what working-class boys from industrial cities were supposed to become. The answer was workers, like their fathers, like their grandfathers, like everyone they knew. You worked with your hands, earned a modest wage, kept your head down, and died having made no particular mark on anything. His first lesson wasn't about music, it was about making do. Manchester in the 1930s and 40s was gray, literally gray, the buildings blackened by industrial soot, the sky perpetually overcast, everything colored in shades of coal dust and rain. His father was a mechanic, a practical man who understood machines better than emotions, who could fix anything with an engine but didn't know what to do with a son who preferred singing to spanners. The family wasn't poor exactly, but they were never far from it either. You patched clothes instead of buying new ones, you made entertainment rather than purchasing it. You learned to find joy in small things because large joys cost money nobody had. Freddie attended Harper Hay Council School where he discovered 2 crucial facts about himself. He wasn't particularly good at academic subjects, and he could make people laugh. The second skill turned out to be more valuable than the first. In a classroom full of working-class kids who'd rather be anywhere else, who saw school as prison they'd escape at 15, being funny meant survival. The tough kids didn't beat up the class clown. Teachers gave you slightly more leeway if you could lighten the mood. And most importantly, laughter created connection. Between you and classmates, between you and a world that otherwise felt indifferent to your existence. He left school at 15. Most working-class kids did, education being a luxury their families couldn't afford to extend. His first job was as a window cleaner, scaling ladders with a bucket and squeegee, making other people's glass transparent for a few shillings. It was honest work, required no particular skill beyond not being afraid of heights, and gave him time to think, or rather, to sing. He'd sing while he worked, music hall numbers mostly, songs his parents' generation knew, and sometimes people in the houses would open windows and listen, tip him an extra penny for the entertainment. Then came the truck driving. Longer hours, better pay, more responsibility. He hauled goods across northern England, Manchester to Liverpool to Leeds and back, seeing the industrial landscape roll by like a black and white film. The job was lonely, just you and the road and the cargo, but Freddie didn't mind lonely. He sang while he drove, practiced harmonies with himself, worked out melodies in his head. He didn't think of it as career preparation. He thought of it as passing time. But those hours alone, singing to no one, teaching himself to carry a tune without accompaniment, turned out to be better training than any music school could have provided. After school, Freddie did what most working-class Manchester boys did. He got a job. First as a window cleaner, then as a truck driver, hauling goods across northern England, watching the landscape roll by and singing to himself because there was nothing else to do during those long drives. He had a pleasant voice, nothing extraordinary but pleasant. And he loved music, skiffle mostly, that working-class folk music that was all about making something from nothing, using washboards and tea-chest bus because proper instruments cost too much. In 1959, at 23, Freddie did something his father thought was insane. He started a band, called them Freddie and the Dreamers, partly because he was Freddie and partly because dreamers felt right. People who believed something impossible might happen if you wanted it badly enough. In 1959, at 23, Freddie did something his father thought was insane. He started a band, called them Freddie and the Dreamers, partly because he was Freddie and partly because dreamers felt right. People who believed something impossible might happen if you wanted it badly enough. The Dreamers were Roy Crudson on guitar, Derek Quinn on lead guitar, Pete Burrell on bass, and Bernie Dwyer on drums. They were all working-class Manchester lads, all in their early 20s, all good enough musicians but not virtuosos, not prodigies. What they had was enthusiasm, reliability, and the ability to learn songs quickly. They'd meet in Bernie's mother's living room, teaching themselves covers from records, working out harmonies by trial and error, arguing good-naturedly about arrangements. The skiffle movement was dying by then. That working-class folk music that had swept Britain in the mid-50s, all washboards and tea-chest bass because proper instruments cost too much. But Freddie had loved skiffle's democratic spirit, the idea that anyone could make music, that you didn't need formal training or expensive equipment, that passion mattered more than polish. The Dreamers carried that spirit into rock and roll, keeping things simple, accessible, unpretentious. They played local clubs first. The Oasis in Manchester, small venues that paid £5 a night split 5 ways. Then weddings, where drunk uncles would request songs they didn't know and they'd have to improvise. Then working men's clubs, where the audience talked through your set unless you grabbed their attention in the first 30 seconds. It was brutal training, the kind that either makes you good or makes you quit. The Dreamers got good. Freddie emerged as natural frontman not because he was the best musician. Roy and Derek were more technically skilled, but because he had something they didn't, the ability to connect with audiences immediately. He'd talk between songs, make jokes, tell stories, turn a performance into a conversation. And when he started jumping, that accidental discovery in Blackpool, he became impossible to ignore. The others provided solid musical foundation. Freddie provided the spark. They played local clubs, weddings, anywhere that would have them. The pay was terrible, the venues worse, but Freddie loved it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hauling boxes or cleaning windows. He was making people happy and getting paid for it. Not much, but enough. The Dreamers were different from other bands starting up around Manchester and Liverpool in those days. They weren't trying to be dangerous or sexy or revolutionary. They were trying to be fun. Their songs were simple, catchy, the kind of thing you could hum after hearing once. Their performances were energetic but goofy, more like a children's party than a rock concert. And Freddie was the human embodiment of enthusiasm, bouncing around stage like someone had wound him up and forgotten to tell him to stop. He made joy look like anyone could do it. In 1963, everything changed. Their single, I'm Telling You Now, hit #1 in Britain, rising up the charts while the Beatles dominated everything else. It wasn't sophisticated, wasn't trying to change music or make profound statements. It was just happy. Unabashedly, unapologetically happy, and Britain in 1963, still gray from the war years, still rationing in living memory, needed happy. America came next. The British invasion was in full swing. Beatles, Stones, Who, Kinks, dozens of British bands flooding American airwaves. Freddie and the Dreamers were part of that wave, though they always felt like the odd ones out. The Beatles were genius, the Stones were dangerous, the Who were angry, the Dreamers were cheerful. The world had the Beatles, Freddie would say later. We were the smile in between. They weren't cool, weren't trying to be. They were the band that made your parents smile, that kids could watch without confusion, that existed to make people feel good for 3 minutes at a time. The jump happened by accident. The microphone stand at a club in Blackpool was too low. Freddie couldn't reach it properly, so he jumped. The crowd laughed, so he jumped again. They laughed harder. By the end of the night, he was incorporating jumps into every song, flailing his arms and legs mid-air like a cartoon character who'd forgotten how gravity worked. It looked ridiculous. It was ridiculous, that was the point. The Freddie became a dance craze briefly in 1965. Instructions printed in teen magazines, kids across America and Britain trying to replicate that awkward, flailing energy. It didn't last long. Dance crazes never did. But for a few months, millions of people were intentionally making themselves look silly to music. And Freddie thought that was beautiful. The world took itself so seriously. Someone needed to demonstrate that looking foolish was fine, that dignity was overrated, that the worst thing that could happen if you jumped funny was nothing. People would laugh, and laughter was good. The jump was also refusal. Refusal of cynicism, of cool detachment, of the idea that joy required justification. Every time Freddie launched himself into the air, he was choosing lightness over weight, choosing to believe that making people happy, even through something as ridiculous as a flailing jump, was work worth doing. Joy as craft, lightness as labor. Behind the cheerfulness everyone saw, was there a loneliness nobody noticed? Not really. And that's what made Freddie unusual. Most performers, you dig beneath the stage persona and find sadness, insecurity, damage that drove them to seek validation from strangers. Freddie was actually that happy. Off stage, at home in Manchester, he was the same person. Silly, kind, quick to laugh, genuinely delighted by small pleasures. The touring years, 1963 to 1966 particularly, were intense. The Dreamers crisscrossed Britain and America, sometimes playing multiple cities in a single day, living on tour buses and in cheap hotels, existing on fish and chips and whatever local food they could grab between sound checks. It was exhausting, exhilarating, occasionally terrifying when audiences got too excited and security was thin. In America, they toured with Herman's Hermits, another Manchester band who'd made it big. Peter Noon, Herman's frontman, became a genuine friend. They'd sit together on the tour bus, comparing notes about American audiences, laughing about how seriously everyone took British accents, plotting elaborate pranks on road managers. Freddie could walk into any room and it became a party, Peter said later, and it was true. Freddie had that gift of making wherever he was feel lighter, more fun. The relationship with the Beatles was complicated by geography and circumstance. They were all Northerners, all working-class boys made good, but the Beatles operated on a different level entirely. Still, they'd cross paths at television studios, awards, ceremonies, the occasional party. Paul McCartney was kind, treated Freddie and the Dreamers as colleagues rather than competition, understood they were all in the same strange business of trying to stay sane while the world went mad around them. The madman who kept us grounded, Paul called him once, and Freddie treasured that. The idea that his silliness served a purpose beyond entertainment, that it reminded more serious artists not to lose perspective. Cilla Black, another Liverpool singer, became a touring companion on several British package tours. Those marathon shows where 8 or 9 acts would perform on the same bill, each getting 20 minutes to win over the crowd. Scylla appreciated Freddie's professionalism, his lack of ego, the way he'd help younger acts with stage fright by making them laugh before they went on. He'd trip on stage, fall down, and people loved him more for it, she remembered. The falling was usually intentional, but audiences never quite knew, which made it funnier. He married young, stayed married, had children who remembered him as fully present and goofy, the kind of dad who'd do funny voices and make breakfast into a production number. Freddie married Christine in 1961 before the Dreamers had any real success, when he was still driving trucks and playing clubs for pocket money. She was a Manchester girl, practical and grounded, exactly what he needed. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by fame when it came, who'd keep the household normal even when nothing else was. They had 2 children born in the mid-60s when Freddie was at peak fame, traveling constantly, barely home. But when he was home, he was completely present. No talk of business, no rehashing of performances, no dwelling on chart positions or reviews. He'd play with the kids in the garden, teach them silly songs, make up elaborate stories at bedtime featuring characters with ridiculous voices. His daughter would later say she didn't realize he was famous until she was 7 or 8, when classmates started asking for autographs. At home, he was just dad. Funny, affectionate, slightly embarrassing in the way all dads are embarrassing. Manchester remained home base throughout everything. Even when the Dreamers could have afforded London, could have moved to be closer to the industry, Freddie refused. London was for working. Manchester was for living. He stayed in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up, shopped at the same stores, drank at the same pubs. People knew him, of course. You couldn't be on television weekly and remain anonymous, but they treated him normally, which he appreciated. Nobody asked for autographs at the corner shop. The local pub landlord would tease him about a performance, then pour his pint without fanfare. He supported Manchester City Football Club with the passion of someone who'd been watching them since childhood, attending matches when touring allowed, following scores obsessively when it didn't. Football was tribal identity, connection to place and people, reminder that no matter how strange his life got on the road, he was still a Manchester lad who cared desperately about whether City won on Saturday. His bandmates liked him, which was rare. Most bands imploded from ego conflicts and creative tensions. The Dreamers just got along. They weren't trying to be the biggest or best. They were having fun making music together, and when it stopped being fun, they stopped doing it. Simple as that. The lack of darkness made him easy to dismiss. Critics never knew what to do with Freddie and the Dreamers. They weren't bad enough to mock effectively, weren't good enough to praise seriously, weren't interesting enough to analyze deeply. They were just nice. And nice wasn't cool, wasn't edgy, wasn't the kind of thing music journalists built careers writing about. Freddie didn't mind. They called us silly, he said in an interview years later, but people still hum our songs. Maybe silly lasts longer. He was right. The Beatles were studied in universities, but the Dreamers were hummed in kitchens, sung to babies, played at parties where nobody cared about artistic merit. They just wanted to dance. When trust becomes performance, how do you stay sincere? You just do. That was Freddie's secret, though it wasn't really a secret. He wasn't performing sincerity, he was just sincere. In an industry built on manufactured images and calculated personas, Freddie remained himself. A working-class Manchester lad who liked making people laugh and happened to be doing it on television. The British invasion ended. Musical tastes changed. By the late 1960s, rock was getting serious. Concept albums, political statements, psychedelic experimentation. There was no room for a little man in oversized glasses jumping around singing about how you were made for him. Freddie and the Dreamers faded from charts, From American consciousness, from the conversation about important music, Freddie moved on without bitterness. The band had given him a decade of making people happy, had paid better than truck driving, had let him see the world and meet interesting people. What was there to be bitter about? Not every career lasts forever. Most don't. You enjoy it while it happens, and then you find the next thing. The next thing was children's television. From 1968 to 1973, Freddie hosted Little Big Time, a variety show for kids. He was perfect for it, energetic without being manic, funny without being mean, able to make children laugh without condescending to them. He treated them like people who deserved entertainment, not like idiots who'd watch anything. The show was beloved, turned Freddie into a different kind of famous. Not pop star famous, but, oh, that's the nice man from the telly famous. Little Big Time ran on Saturday mornings, prime children's viewing, and featured a mix of music, comedy sketches, and guest acts. Often other performers from the 60s trying to remain relevant as musical tastes changed. Freddie's segments were reliably chaotic. He'd attempt magic tricks that went wrong, interview sock puppets with more seriousness than they deserved, lead dance numbers where the choreography was deliberately terrible so kids at home wouldn't feel intimidated trying to copy it. The show's genius was that Freddie never played down to children. He talked to them like equals, asked their opinions about music and jokes, treated their responses as genuinely interesting rather than cute material to patronize. When kids wrote in with problems, being bullied at school, parents divorcing, feeling lonely, Freddie would address them seriously before making a joke to lighten the mood. He understood that children needed entertainment that acknowledged their emotional reality while still being fun. Behind the scenes, he was meticulous about material. He kept a notebook filled with jokes, constantly testing new ones, discarding anything that felt mean-spirited or relied on making someone feel small. Punch up, not down, he'd tell the writers. You could make fun of yourself, of authority figures, of absurd situations, but not of kids trying their best, not of vulnerable people. Comedy should make the world feel lighter, not crueler. The show ran for 5 years, won several children's television awards, and introduced a generation of British kids to the idea that adults could be silly and trustworthy simultaneously. Long after it ended, Freddie would be stopped in supermarkets by people in their 30s and 40s who'd tell him they'd watched every Saturday morning, that he'd gotten them through difficult childhoods, that his silliness had been a kind of permission slip to be joyful even when life was hard. It was better in some ways. Pop stardom had been exciting but ephemeral. This felt solid, meaningful. Kids would write him letters, draw him pictures, tell him he'd made them feel better when they were sad or sick or lonely. That mattered more than chart positions, than appearing on Ed Sullivan, than any of it. He'd gotten into this to make people happy. Kids were people. He was succeeding. He didn't die from the performance. He died proving joy was enough. Freddie kept performing his whole life. After the TV show ended, he did nostalgia tours, playing to audiences who remembered the 1960s fondly and wanted to feel young again for an evening. He played working men's clubs, holiday parks, anywhere that booked him. He wasn't chasing comeback glory or desperately clinging to past fame. He just liked performing, liked making people smile, and as long as anyone would pay him to do it, why stop? The nostalgia circuit in the 1970s and 80s was a strange ecosystem. Former stars playing to crowds who remembered them in their prime, everyone pretending the intervening years hadn't happened, suspending disbelief for 90 minutes while "I'm telling you now" made everyone 25 again. Some performers found it depressing, this constant reminder that their best days were behind them. Freddie found it honest. People aged, tastes changed, careers had arcs. So what? The songs still worked, audiences still enjoyed them, and he was still getting paid to jump around making people happy. That was the job. It had always been the job. He'd often be on bills with other British invasion acts, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Searchers, Wayne Fontana, all of them mining the same seam of nostalgia, all aware they were trading on past glories but doing it with professionalism and good humor. Backstage, they'd swap stories about the old days, the crazy tours, the television appearances, the madness of 1964 when British bands couldn't walk down American streets without causing riots. They were like war veterans, bonded by shared experience of something extraordinary that nobody else quite understood. The venues got smaller as decades passed, from arenas to theaters to clubs. But Freddie's energy remained consistent. He'd give a crowd of 200 the same effort he'd given 2,000, same jumps, same jokes, same genuine delight in making people happy. Some nights the audience was packed with people who'd screamed for him in 1964. Other nights it was their children brought along to see what Mum and Dad had been going on about. And increasingly, as he entered his 60s, it was grandchildren. 3 generations experiencing that ridiculous jump together. He modified his act carefully as he aged. Fewer jumps, more strategically placed, acknowledging his limitations with self-deprecating humor that made audiences love him more. "I used to jump this high," he'd say, hand well above his head. "Now I jump this high, hand at knee level, but I jump with conviction." And he did. Even when his knees protested, even when landing jarred his back, even when everything hurt the next morning. The jump was the thing. It was what people came for, what they remembered, what they needed to see to believe they weren't just watching an old man go through motions, but someone still committed to the bit after 50 years. The audiences changed over the years. The teenagers who'd screamed for him in 1963 brought their children, then their grandchildren. Freddie stayed the same, older, slower, but still that same ridiculous energy, still that same genuine delight in making people happy. He'd do the jump, even when his knees protested, even when it looked less like defying gravity and more like an old man falling with style. People laughed anyway, loved him for trying, for being 70 and still committed to the bit. Paul McCartney, running into him at some industry event in the 1990s, called him the madman who kept us grounded. It was the perfect description. When everyone else was taking themselves deadly seriously, competing for importance and legacy, Freddie was just there being ridiculous and kind, reminding people that music was supposed to be fun, that fun was allowed, that you didn't have to change the world. Sometimes making someone smile for 3 minutes was enough. He married once, stayed married 40+ years, lived in Manchester near where he'd grown up, never pretended to be anything other than what he was. A working-class lad who'd gotten lucky and never forgot it. He gardened, cooked, supported Manchester City Football Club with the passion of someone who'd been watching them since childhood. He lived a completely normal life that happened to include being famous for jumping funny. In 2006, at 69, Freddie died suddenly while traveling back from a performance. Heart attack, quick, no suffering. The funeral was in Manchester, attended by hundreds, old bandmates, television colleagues, fans who'd grown up with him. But it wasn't somber. How could it be? This was Freddie. Someone played Do the Freddie and people danced. They laughed, shared stories, celebrated a life that had been fundamentally joyful. The last performance had been in Bangor, Wales, May 19, 2006. A small venue, part of a nostalgia tour that was hitting working men's clubs and modest theaters across Britain. The crowd was maybe 100 people, mix of ages, all there because they'd loved the Dreamers or because their parents had and they were curious. Freddie did his full set, the hits, the jumps, the jokes between songs. He seemed tired afterward, colleagues said, but satisfied. He'd done the job properly, made people happy, which was all he'd ever wanted to do. The next morning on the coach heading home to Manchester, he had a massive heart attack. Gone quickly, no hospital vigil, no protracted decline. Just there and then not there, between 1 mile and the next. His bandmates were with him, which felt right. He'd spent most of his adult life on buses and coaches with them, traveling between gigs, and he died the same way. Working. The funeral at St. Paul's Church in Manchester was packed beyond capacity, people standing in aisles and spilling out into the street. The usual sad hymns were played, the usual prayers said, but the mood wasn't mournful. Speaker after speaker told funny stories. Freddie falling on stage in 1964, Freddie making children laugh on television, Freddie being kind to nervous young performers, Freddie supporting Manchester City through decades of disappointment with unwavering optimism. The portrait that emerged was of someone fundamentally decent, professional, consistently joyful even when he had every reason not to be. And then, near the end, someone nobody remembered who suggested it first put on a recording of Do the Freddie. The instruction manual from 1965, Freddie's voice explaining how to do the jump, demonstrating the arm movements, encouraging everyone to try. And people did. In a church, at a funeral, mourners stood and jumped and flailed their arms, and it wasn't disrespectful, it was exactly right. It was what Freddie would have wanted, what he'd spent 50 years teaching people to do. Let go of dignity, embrace silliness, choose joy even when circumstances suggested otherwise. His headstone read, "He made us laugh, he made us dance." That was the legacy. Not chart positions, not critical acclaim, not influence on later musicians, though the Dreamers had influenced plenty more than people realized. The legacy was simple. For a little while, he'd made the world slightly happier, and that was worth something. Maybe worth everything. His heart didn't fail. It just finished celebrating. After Freddie died, people wrote about him the way they always had, with a kind of affectionate dismissal, as if joy was less important than seriousness, as if making children laugh was less significant than making critics think. But the obituaries, even when slightly condescending, couldn't deny the fundamental fact. People loved him, not admired him, not respected him necessarily, but loved him. And love matters more than admiration. His music didn't age well in the traditional sense. It was never sophisticated enough to reward repeated analysis, never complex enough to reveal new layers. But it aged well in the way that matters. It still made people happy. You could play I'm Telling You Now for a 5-year-old in 2024 and they'd bounce along delighted, not caring that it was recorded before their grandparents were born. Joy doesn't date. The jump became iconic in retrospect. You can find clips online of Freddie doing that ridiculous flailing leap, and people share them when they need cheering up, when the world feels heavy and they need reminded that silliness is allowed, that dignity is overrated, that sometimes the best thing you can do is jump like an idiot and see if anyone laughs. Did his simplicity mark him as lightweight, or prove that lightness itself has weight? Lightness has weight. That's what Freddie proved, whether he meant to or not. In a culture obsessed with depth and seriousness, with artists tortured by their demons and audiences wanting profundity, Freddie demonstrated that making people happy was harder than it looked. That sustaining joy required work. That lightness was a choice you made every day, even when the world gave you reasons to be heavy. He'd grown up poor, worked brutal jobs, lived through wars and recessions and personal losses like everyone does. He had plenty of reasons to be cynical, bitter, to write songs about suffering and darkness. He chose not to. Not because he was naive or shallow, but because he believed people had enough darkness already. They didn't need more from him. What they needed was 3 minutes of forgetting their problems, of feeling light, of being silly. That's harder than writing a sad song. Anyone can access sadness. It's universal, always available. Choosing joy, maintaining joy, transmitting joy to others when you're tired and aging and the world keeps getting complicated, that takes effort. Freddie made it look effortless, which was the trick. The jump looked spontaneous, instinctive, like he couldn't help but be happy. But he'd been doing it for 40 years. That's not instinct. That's discipline disguised as delight. Jump, 1965. Land, 2005. Working-class audiences understood this in a way critics never quite did. When you've worked a factory job for 20 years, when you're exhausted and underpaid and not quite sure how you'll make rent, you don't need art that makes you think about how hard life is. You're living it. You need art that lets you escape for a moment, that reminds you life can be light, that gives you permission to be silly. Freddie gave them that, and they loved him for it. Addiction taught him what fame never could, that happiness is a practice, not a prize. Freddie had never been addicted to substances, too sensible, too working-class practical to risk his career or health that way. But he'd been addicted to the work, to performing, to the validation of laughter. Early on, when the dreamers were huge, he'd needed the applause, needed the confirmation that he was doing it right, that people were happy because of him. Age had taught him something different, that happiness wasn't something he created for others, but something they chose for themselves with his help. He could jump and sing and be silly, but the audience had to meet him halfway, had to be willing to let go of dignity and cynicism long enough to laugh. His job wasn't to make them happy. His job was to give them permission to choose happiness. That's what kept him performing into his 60s, not in stadiums, but in small venues where he could see people's faces, where the connection was immediate and real. Not because he needed it anymore, but because he'd gotten good at it, and it seemed wasteful not to use a skill he'd spent a lifetime developing. Like a carpenter who keeps making chairs because he knows how and people need chairs. Freddie kept making people laugh because he knew how and people needed laughter. Can anyone ever truly leave the stage? No, if the stage is where you found yourself. Freddie had been a truck driver before music, a window cleaner, forgettable and forgotten. On stage, jumping around and making people laugh, he'd become someone. Not famous necessarily, but purposeful. The stage gave him a reason to exist beyond just existing. Of course, he couldn't leave it, but he also didn't need it the way some performers do. Didn't require the validation of strangers to feel real. He could go home to Manchester, live quietly, and be perfectly content. The stage was where he worked, not who he was. That distinction kept him sane when others lost themselves. Were his final decades acts of desperation or victory in different register? Victory. Absolute victory, though not the kind anyone writes about. Freddie's later years weren't about declining fame or fading relevance. They were about a man doing what he loved, with people who appreciated it, for as long as his body allowed. He played small venues because small venues booked him, not because he was desperate, but because he was available and they wanted what he offered. He gave himself to everyone who asked. Nostalgia tours, charity events, local festivals, anywhere that needed someone to make people smile for an hour. His time wasn't scarce because he didn't make it scarce. He was working class in the best sense. If someone needed something he could provide and they offered fair payment, why say no? The last performance was in Wales, May 2006. Small club, modest crowd, nothing special. Freddie did what he always did. Jumped, sang, made people laugh, went home tired but satisfied. Died the next day quickly on the road. 70 years old, still working, still jumping, still choosing joy even when his knees hurt and traveling was exhausting and easier options existed. Before he died, he'd written letters to a few close friends. One of them, found after his funeral, ended with, "Keep jumping. Life's lighter that way." It was so perfectly Freddie, turning a silly dance move into philosophy, making wisdom sound like a joke, giving advice that was both profound and ridiculous simultaneously. A small club somewhere in Wales, 2005. Freddie stands before a crowd of 50, 60 maybe. His knees hurt, his back protests, but when the music starts, he jumps. Smaller now, less height, more faith. Someone yells from the back, "Go on, Freddie!" He grins, adjusts his glasses, says, "I would love, but gravity's gotten stricter since 1965. The room erupts. He jumps again anyway. His absence became its own kind of presence. the room that's quieter without laughter. After Freddie died, British television ran retrospectives. Clips of the dreamers in their heyday, interviews from later years, footage of Little Big Time with Freddie making children giggle. The compilation revealed something that wasn't obvious moment to moment: consistency. Freddie in 1963 and Freddie in 2005 were the same person, same energy, same genuine delight, same commitment to making people happy. In an industry famous for destroying people, for turning earnest artists into cynical shells, Freddie had remained unchanged. Not because he was naive or protected, but because he'd figured something out early. That happiness was valuable. That joy was work worth doing, and that you didn't need to be tortured or complex or deep to matter. You just needed to show up and try to make things lighter. Musicians started citing him as influence in unexpected ways. Not his music, which was never sophisticated enough to influence compositionally, but his approach. The idea that entertainment could be just that, entertainment, without needing to be art or statement or revolution. That making people feel good was a valid goal, maybe the only goal that mattered. Every performer who chooses joy over profundity is channeling him, knowingly or not. Maybe that's what legacy is, not being remembered for being the best, but for being necessary. Freddie was never the best at anything, not the best singer, not the best songwriter, not the best performer. But he was necessary in a way that genius sometimes isn't. When the world got too heavy, when music got too serious, when everyone was competing for importance, there was Freddie jumping around like an idiot, reminding people that fun was allowed. His recordings circulate still, mostly on nostalgia compilations, sometimes in films set in the 1960s, occasionally as curiosity when someone discovers the British invasion went deeper than Beatles and Stones. The songs sound dated, product of their time. Simple almost to the point of simplicity. But if you're in the right mood, if you need 3 minutes of uncomplicated joy, they still work. That's not nothing. The jump lives on too. In clips shared online when people need to smile, in tribute bands that replicate it faithfully, in random moments when someone trying to explain the dreamers gives up on words and just demonstrates, flailing arms and legs and looking ridiculous, and everyone laughs because how can you not? It's the most ridiculous thing, that's why it's perfect. The photograph they used at his memorial showed Freddie mid-jump, 1965, caught in that moment of apparent weightlessness before gravity reasserts itself. He's grinning, arms everywhere, completely committed to the bit. On the back, someone had written, "Proof that it worked." And it had worked. For 40 years, consistently, reliably, it had worked. He'd made people laugh, made them dance, made them feel lighter. What more could anyone ask from a life? He wasn't profound like Lennon or dangerous like Jagger. He was something harder, honest, ordinary, joy-shaped. The jump was the sermon, laughter, the proof. Sunday night, 1965. The Ed Sullivan stage burns white. A tiny Mancunian in an oversized suit chooses to defy gravity one more time. And maybe that's what performing is. Temporarily escaping weight, making the impossible look easy, choosing to jump even when staying grounded is safer. Freddie jumped his whole life, literally and metaphorically, and the world was lighter for it. When joy outlasts genius, is it accident or art in its purest form? And if laughter is the only echo that remains, does it matter who started the song?